Hello. As many people know, I do a lot of reading, and I particularly do a lot of reading during the summers when it's not the school year, since I'm a high school teacher. And I find that often I have thoughts, and these thoughts I'm often like, I'd like to write these down, only I'm just often just not disciplined. And when I actually sit down to write these things down, I find I don't have a clear outline of what I'm going to say. So I'm going to try doing video book reviews. And so this is what I'm going to try, and we'll see how it works out. So today I wanted to start with a review of a book that's just come out, a book called The Toxic War on Masculinity by Nancy Pearcey. Nancy Pearcey has been writing some really excellent books for the last few years. I'm old enough to remember when she used to be a co-writer with Chuck Colson, and now, of course, Chuck Colson is in glory, and Nancy Pearcey is writing some very excellent books. So there's her book, Love Thy Body, which came out a few years ago, and I've only read part of, but what I've read has been very helpful. And then there's Total Truth. And this is a book that I was very excited to hear about because The Toxic War on Masculinity is about the need for Christian men and Christian manhood. Why is it that Christian men matter? And there's a number of things that I think this does well. And I'm going to talk right now about the things that I think are very helpful about this book. I might come back in a later video and talk about some of the places where I think more could have been said. But in a book like this, first of all, it is very hard to fault Pearcey for things she didn't say. And because one of the criticisms that can often be made of books is that, I wish they would have addressed this or such and such. And sometimes I think that's a fair criticism, and other times that isn't. And I'm still not sure about that in this book, because the issues that Pearcey she addresses in a lot of detail. She talks about, for example, the history of the narrative around masculinity. How is it, she asks at the beginning of the book, that we came to view masculinity itself as toxic? And she immediately, makes this bifurcation between sort of the quote-unquote real man narrative, what is a real man versus what is a good man. And she identifies different sets of characteristics that characterize either quote-unquote real men or good men. This is very helpful, and it helps to frame the rest of her narrative because she goes through the history, and she goes through the history in very exquisite detail, with lots and lots of documentary evidence from all sorts of sources, so even sources that she would disagree with, to talk about how, particularly through the 19th century, because of the changing economies in the Industrial Revolution, men's and women's worlds, not just their roles, but their worlds get separated, and the way that this affects men's roles in society, but also in the home. And I'm very appreciative of the way that she does that. She also talks about Christian responses that were good, Christian responses that were overcorrections, and Christian responses that were inadequate to the problems being faced. And so I think from those perspectives, it's a very helpful book. Primarily, though, this is addressing the need for husbands and fathers, good husbands and fathers, and about the positive contributions that they can have within society and within the family. And so that's the primary focus of the book. And so as a single man, on the one hand, I find this very helpful because it's like, okay, as someone who can get discouraged in thinking that, the message that I'm getting from, the larger world is that I'm not needed. This is, saying, no, men are needed. But on the other hand, there are certain men's issues that probably could have been addressed that weren't. But I'm not sure I can fault Pearcey for that, just because, if it's difficult to criticize a book for not saying something that the author didn't set out to say, or not addressing problems that the author didn't set out to address. And so, because this is really addressing cultural narratives about masculinity. So this is not a book that is setting out to fix men, which I'm very grateful for. I'm very grateful that this is not a book that is setting out to fix men. It is a book that is setting out to correct the narrative around masculinity and say there is a form of male dominance that is wrong, but that does not mean masculinity itself is the problem. There's a good form of masculinity and there is a not so good form of masculinity. There is a right narrative about masculinity, and then there is a wrong cultural narrative about masculinity. And one of the ways that she highlights the wrong narrative is by citing statistics. She says, look, if we look at the statistics on all of these different things, what we see is that men who are Christians and who are serious about their faith, that is, they are regular church attenders, for example, they have far lower divorce rates. They have far lower rates of abuse. They have far higher engagement with their families. Those sorts of statistics are actually very encouraging. They're telling us good Christian men are needed. And part of our crisis is in not recognizing that good men are needed. We need good men. I'm very blessed to have been raised by a good man and a good woman, but I'm very blessed to have been encouraged in my masculinity by godly Christian parents. And, the experience. And it's very interesting for Pearcey to be writing about this because of her own experience of not having been raised by a good man, not being raised by a man who was abusive. And she talks about her story in that regard. And so, that's very good to hear. And she's very clear also in the need to confront abuse. But she also doesn't paint a one-sided picture either. She doesn't paint this picture like, men who, are, heading down towards some of these more toxic traits are irredeemable. She doesn't go that direction either. And I think that's helpful. It's, that there's a right way to confront abuse and there's a wrong way to either not confront it or to enable it. And so those are very helpful chapters. So there's a lot in this book, I think, that's very helpful, and I would commend it. So, and maybe in a future video, I'll talk about some of the things that didn't go addressed that I think are valid men's issues, and maybe even think about why maybe Pearcey didn't choose to focus on some of those. But overall, this is a very well-researched book. This is a book that has a lot of good biblical truth in it. It's also a book that has a lot of just helpful history. So, one thing that this talks about that is not often talked about, or not talked about nearly as often as it should be, is sort of the conditions of the household and the economic conditions of the household. So, many times when we're talking about some of these issues in the family, it's addressed primarily in terms of relationships between men and women without really looking at the economic conditions and even the ways in which, the Industrial Revolution broke apart men's and women's worlds so that men, women, and their children were no longer working together for the common good of the household, this little republic, if you will, that would also include people who were not directly blood related, but this little republic that was the fundamental economic unit of society, and that the breakdown of that was a huge catastrophe for relationships between men and women. That's an issue that often goes unaddressed in some of the literature. And it's also helpful, I think, that Pearcey thinks we need to maybe recover some of that idea of the household economy and the household project, the home we build together, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has said. But the home we build together is not just a source of consumption, but as a source of production, as a place of production where we can go not just as a refuge from the outside world of economics and striving, but as a place that we go to build something that bears fruit, build something that has economic value. That's rare to see, and I appreciate that Pearcey has chosen to talk about that. So hopefully you find this helpful. Hopefully I will talk some more about some of these other issues, but I will talk to you later.